In the still darkness of an ancient age, when the earth still bled after the great flood, a silent curse spread across the land. Humanity, in its arrogance and delusion, carved lifeless idols with their own hands and bowed before them in worship. Somewhere in the night, whispers echoed. Were they the calls of dark spirits or the cries of forgotten souls? The language of man crumbled into dust on the day the tower that reached for the heavens fell, leaving the world in silence and division. Yet amidst that darkness, a faint light began to rise. It was no ordinary light, but a sacred flame seeping through the cracks of human folly. It was a promise, a mission, a key that would lead to a mysterious land where destiny could be rewritten. Signs in the heavens, the dusty pages of ancient texts, and a call from eternity all intertwined, leading to a journey with no escape. Between the curse and the blessing, between darkness and light, where does the truth lie? And who among us is brave enough to step through the thick veil of night? The answers dwell within the pages of the forgotten books. Welcome to Why the Book of Jubilees was banned Part 3. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the thrilling Part 4 coming soon. In the silent darkness of time, when the final waves of the Great Flood subsided, the world emerged from the ruins, heavy and cold. Upon the still drenched earth, a great division took place, a decree of destiny for the lands where future generations would thrive, build, and destroy. Few witnessed that day, but the oaths and curses they left behind endured for millennia, taking root in every inch of earth, every mountain, and every river. The Book of Jubilees recorded that moment, the moment Noah and his sons divided the world, binding it to an eternal fate. Ham, Noah's second son, was the first to rise in this division. With cold eyes and trembling hands heavy with purpose, he divided his portion among his sons. Cush received the eastern lands, where dawn awakens beneath the pale white mist, covering dense forests untouched by human footsteps. It was a pristine, mysterious realm where the whispers of the woods and stagnant waters sang like the lament of wandering souls. Farther west lay the land given to Mizraim, a vast plain tinged with death. The soil there was as parched as the cracked palms of the departed, a place where stone tombs and great monuments would later rise, defying the ravages of time. Behind Mizraim was Put, whose lands stretched westward toward the edge of the endless desert. There, sand and wind fused into an unchanging, haunting canvas where night stretched infinitely, and life became imperceptible. Finally, the land of Canaan lay even farther, reaching the sea's edge. The crashing waves resounded like echoes of ancient curses. That land, cold and unyielding, seemed marked by the invisible hand of divine punishment. It was believed that it lay forgotten secrets, sunken temples buried beneath black waters, and prophecies never deciphered. Meanwhile, Shem, the eldest son, bearer of his father's wisdom, performed his division. The first portion was given to the descendants of Ham, stretching from the eastern banks of the Tigris River to the distant lands of India. This territory extended to the shores of the Red Sea, encompassing the waters of Dedan. There, the mountains of Mebri and Elah stood like giants guarding time, their shadows stretching across the land of Susan, a realm veiled in misty valleys and ruins. Farther still, the river Tina rushed fiercely, carrying untold stories, whispers from the beginning of time. The second portion belonged to Ashur, Shem's son. It encompassed the vast land of Ashur, where cities like Nineveh and Shinar would rise, empires glorious yet steeped in sin. The borders of this land reached India, where green forests and towering mountains converged into a somber tapestry. Rivers flowed endlessly, lining the banks like veins of the earth. carrying the breath of ancient gods. Next arose the land of Arpachshad, stretched like a scorched ribbon, east of the Euphrates River. This territory extended to the Red Sea and bordered the arid deserts leading toward Egypt. There, the dust murmured to the wind of cities lost to oblivion. The still waters of the desert, beneath the moon's light, appeared like the eyes of restless souls. Beyond, Lebanon, Sanir, and Amana stood solemnly, guarding the western borders like walls that separated time and space. Then came Abram, Shem's fourth son, who inherited the legendary land of Mesopotamia, lying between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This land teemed with life, yet lay shrouded in darkness. The rushing waters carried the spirits of lost kingdoms. To the north, Aram's territory bordered the land of the Chaldees and the soaring mountains of Ashur. Beyond stretched the land of Arara, a desolate realm where darkness never lifted, and winds carried the scent of an ancient past. Finally, Lud, Shem's youngest son, received the fifth portion. It was the mighty Ashur mountains that stretched to the Great Sea, where the dark waters reflected visions none wished to behold. Farther still, the eastern border of this land touched the boundary of Ashur, a constant reminder of the unbreakable bond between the lineages. The final portion of the earth fell to the sons of Japheth, the youngest of Noah's children. In the shadow of time, their names echoed like a call from the distant past. Javan was given the lands stretching across the islands, where the sea had shattered the world into fragments, just as it had devoured all before. These islands lay silent on the borders of Lud's land, like scattered gems detached from the mainland, where the waves crashed against the shores, echoing the cries of thousands of restless souls. Farther to the north, Tubal was granted the fifth portion. Strangely, this land lay among tongues of earth jutting into the sea, strips of land like giant fingers reaching from the ocean's depths. From the borders of Lud's portion, it extended across the second tongue and reached the third tongue, where the solid ground gradually vanished, and the sea consumed all. The darkness of these lands was thick, as though sunlight had never touched them. Meshech, the brother of Tubal, was given the sixth portion, a vast territory stretching beyond the third tongue of land. This portion extended as far as Gader in the east, where legends spoke of the world's edge sinking into eternal darkness. The black waves lashed like thousands of whips. The sea there was not as peaceful as the southern shores. It was said that this was the land where the sun sank into the abyss, where fire and water clashed in a maddened dance, and time itself was swallowed forever. Finally, Tiras, the youngest son of Japheth, was given 4 great islands in the midst of the sea, like 4 colossal stone tablets marking secrets that would never be unveiled. These islands stretched toward the lands of Ham, where cold waters met the burning breath of his deserts. Yet in that distant place, there lay a final mystery known as Kamaturi, small islands divided by the casting of lots, a strange manner of choice as though God himself was testing man's fate. When the last portion of land was divided, Noah, the aged father with hair white as snow, rose in the midst of his descendants. He gazed across his sons and grandsons, his voice ringing like a cold iron bell, piercing through space and time. "A curse shall fall upon any who seize land that is not their own," he declared, his clouded eyes seeming to peer into the future. "Whoever breaks this order shall face the judgment of the Lord. Fire and sword shall burn away all his iniquities." A fearful silence fell upon the valley where they stood. The sons of Noah, from Ham to Shem to Japheth, bowed their heads in unison and repeated the oath. "Let it be so. O Lord, let it be so." This oath was not merely the pledge of one generation, but the chains binding their descendants forever until the day of final judgment. Yet that oath, like an unseen specter, has followed humanity throughout history. Through every generation, those lands have been torn apart by war, ambition, and insatiable greed. Borders were erased and redrawn with blood and tears. Empires rose and fell. Great cities were buried beneath the dust of time. But Noah's curse continued to echo. From the distant islands of Javan to the frozen territories of Meshech, from the strange tongues of Tubal to the solitary 4 islands of Tiras, all bore the mark of division and destiny. It is said that on moonless nights, when the sea wind screams through cliffs and waves crashing wildly, the voices of the exiled can still be heard, those who broke the oath. They wander among the cursed lands, seeking a place to rest but never finding it. And now, as we stand before the map of the world, gazing upon the tangled borders like scars upon the earth, do we not wonder, is the curse still alive? Or has it died? Are the sword and fire of judgment waiting ahead of us? Or have they silently burned humanity for thousands of years? Noah, with eyes clouded as though bearing the world's burdens, stood among his generation, beholding the rising chaos. He no longer heard the morning songs of birds, nor saw the innocent smiles on his grandchildren's faces. Instead, shadows stretched deep into the night, and soulless screams echoed from distant lands. Children vanished. Youths collapsed in the wilderness, their eyes empty as though their very souls had been stolen. The unclean spirits had returned, luring humanity into paths of destruction, consuming them in the thick darkness of sin and death. Matters grew so dire that Noah's sons came to him, their faces etched with terror as they bore grievous news. They spoke of ghastly apparitions rising in the night, laughing eerily on cold winds, whispering seductive words into the ears of men. Those who succumbed wandered into deep forests, never to return, blinded in mind, stripped of soul, and robbed of all hope. Faced with such horror, Noah had no recourse but to cry out to God, the one who had saved him and his family from the waters of judgment. Standing beneath the vast heavens, he bowed and prayed, his words tearing through the stillness of creation. O Lord God of the spirits of all flesh, you who have shown mercy and saved us from the destructive flood, have mercy upon my descendants. Let not these unclean spirits rule over the sons of my flesh, nor let them destroy them from the earth. You know who they are, for they were created for destruction, and their wickedness knows no bounds. Imprison them in the place of condemnation, so that they may no longer bring calamity. The dominion belongs to you alone, for you alone judge the souls of the living. Noah's prayer rose to the heavens, reaching the throne of God. The clouds above seemed to halt. The winds fell silent, and time stood still. God heard his cry and decreed, "Bind them all." His words cleared the darkness like a sword. Yet at that moment, a figure stepped forth from the shadows, Mastema, the chief of the spirits. His face was pale, his eyes deep as the bottomless night, and his voice echoed like a summons from distant hell. O Lord, Creator, let a portion of them remain before me. Without them, I cannot exercise my power and my will over the children of men. Their wickedness is great, and they must be led astray before your judgment comes upon them. A moment of silence fell as though the entire universe held its breath at the plea of the Dark One. God, in his absolute justice, decreed, "Let a tenth of them remain with you, but the other 9 parts shall be bound in the place of condemnation." His command thundered like lightning, shattering the pride of the darkness. Even so, God knew that though most were bound, Noah's descendants would still need protection and understanding to contend with those that remained. And he commanded an angel, saying, "Teach Noah all the medicines and remedies he needs to know. For I know, mankind will not walk upright forever, and they will need to fight against temptation and darkness." This hidden knowledge was passed down from heaven, like light torches guiding men through the night. Strange medicines, cures for body and soul alike, were delivered into Noah's hands. He became the keeper of wisdom, the guide for his children through the days of darkness. Yet, though they were bound, 1/10 of the spirits remained free. They hid within the shadows, creeping into the hearts of men, stirring greed, anger, and lust. Mastema, with his ominous laughter, continued to lead them like a patient spider weaving its web in the darkness. They appeared everywhere, beneath ancient trees, within abandoned houses, or whispering behind those who wandered alone in the night. The curse and God's judgment had been executed, but darkness had not vanished entirely. Noah, armed with the knowledge he received, safeguarded his descendants, but the world had changed. Those who survived walked a narrow path between light and shadow, clinging to the one hope that God was watching over them. The remaining demons of Mastema stained humanity's rebirth like inky blotches upon a sacred canvas. And when night falls, in the cold howling of the wind, if one listens closely, they will hear the whispers of restless souls and those eternally bound in chains, with the remnants of darkness still lingering. Noah, the chosen one and father of the renewed mankind, was given a task. The angels taught him all the mystical remedies that mankind would need to heal both body and soul from the curses of the unclean spirits. Herbs of the earth, seemingly lifeless, became sharp weapons to shield Noah's descendants from destruction. All these were carefully recorded in a book, the Book of Secret Remedies. Its pages contain not only knowledge but also a warning, a weapon of survival in an age where darkness could devour any soul. Noah understood that this knowledge was not for him alone, but must be passed down to protect humanity. He entrusted the book to Shem, his eldest son and the one he loved most. To Noah, Shem carried the light of righteousness, a heart strong enough to guard the secrets and defend his lineage from the spirits still haunting the earth. Noah's life ended on Mount Luber, in the land of Ararat, where the great ark had once rested. He lived for 950 years, a majestic number in the flow of time. History remembers him as the greatest righteous man after Enoch, appointed as a witness for generations from the beginning until the day of final judgment. Yet even after Noah's passing, darkness still crept into the world of his descendants. At a later time, as generations multiplied, a new name emerged from the shadows of history: Peleg, a descendant of Noah. In the first year of the second week of the 33rd Jubilee, Peleg took a wife named Lamna, daughter of Sinar, and they bore a son in the fourth year. The child was named Ru, born from Peleg's lament. Behold, the children of men have grown wicked. The signs of mankind's fall had begun to manifest. The land of Shinar, a vast plain where men had migrated from the land of Ararat, became the center of pride and arrogance. There, men began to plan the construction of a great work, a city and a tower whose top would reach the heavens. They said to one another, "Come, let us ascend to the heavens from there." This was no longer the dream of ordinary men, but a challenge to God himself. Arrogance that surpassed all limits, driven by the remnants of darkness. They began to build, and the work continued for 43 years. Bricks were burned in fire instead of using stone, and clay was bound with bitumen that flowed from the sea and the waters of the land of Shinar. The numbers of this project were enough to inspire terror. Its height was 5.433 cubits and 2 handbreadths, while its walls extended 13 stadia and were connected by 30 more stadia. A great city, a towering monument, seemed on the verge of completion. But mankind had forgotten that nothing can surpass the power of the Creator. God saw their deeds, and he said, "Behold, they are one people, and this is what they have begun to do. Now, nothing will be impossible for them." This was not merely judgment but a warning. Humanity had gone too far in its pride. God descended to earth, bringing his angels with him. The heavens trembled, and the earth quaked as the gaze of the Creator swept across the city and the tower. The angels stood beside him, witnessing the chaos about to unfold. God said, "Let us confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." And as a curse, the tongues of men suddenly turned into strange sounds, and none could comprehend the words of his neighbor. Bricks fell from confused hands. Shouts echoed across the city, and the great work came to an eternal halt. Men began to abandon the land of Shinar, scattering to the nations and cities across the earth, their common purpose dissolving like mist. For this reason, the land of Shinar, where the tower began, was called Babel, the place where God confused the language of men and scattered them across the earth. From that land, humanity dispersed to the far reaches of the world, each group carrying a new tongue. The city and the tower were left as a cold ruin, buried in dust and wind. In his justice, God sent a mighty wind that tore through the tower and cast it to the ground. In that moment, mankind learned that nothing built upon pride could endure forever. The tower lay in ruins, desolate and shattered, between Ashur and Babylon in the land of Shinar. From that day, men called it overthrow. In the chaos, the families of Ham, Shem, and Japheth were compelled to return to the lands that had been divided to them by destiny. Yet not all obeyed this order. Ham and his sons traveled southward to their allotted portion. But one of Ham's sons, Canaan, disobeyed. He saw the land of Lebanon, a fertile and beautiful region stretching from the borders of the Jordan River to the land of Egypt. The lush fields, the gentle rivers, and the rich soil enthralled him. Instead of settling in the western land by the sea, as had been decreed, Canaan seized Lebanon and remained there. This act ignited the anger of his family. Ham, the father of Canaan, along with Cush and Mizraim, his brothers, warned him, saying, "You have settled in a land that is not yours. Do not do this, for if you persist, you and your descendants will be cursed forever. You have rebelled against the divine order that God has established, and by your rebellion, your offspring will be uprooted from the earth." But Canaan would not listen. Stubbornly, he remained in the land of Lebanon, from Hamath to the borders of Egypt. Despite all warnings, his kinsmen reminded him time and again that this land belonged to Shem and his descendants according to God's division. But it was of no use. For his defiance, Canaan and his lineage were cursed, a curse etched into that land forever so that it would always bear his name, Canaan. At the same time, the family of Japheth also scattered, moving westward to the seas and the lands allotted to them. They accepted the fate assigned to them and settled in those untamed territories. Yet, not all were content. One of Japheth's sons, Madai, saw the coastal lands and was unsatisfied. Seeking another place, he turned to others for land, Ham, Ashur, and Arpachshad, his brother-in-law. Ham and Ashur, though displeased, eventually yielded a portion near their borders. Madai settled in this new land and named it Media to honor his father. From then on, the land became the home of Madai's descendants, a foreign place and a testament to the final compromise in that age of scattered confusion. These events were not merely the stories of men, but a testament to the curse of rebellion. Canaan seized land not meant for him, and as a consequence, his lineage was cursed for eternity. The Tower of Babel fell not merely by wind and the wrath of God, but by the boundless ambition and pride of man. From that moment, language became a wall dividing mankind, and nations were driven far apart like shards of a shattered mirror. The land of Shinar, with its ruined tower, became a symbol of humanity's failure to surpass God. The scorched bricks and the binding bitumen now lie beneath layers of dust, a warning to all generations that followed. Meanwhile, the land of Canaan, verdant and fertile, forever bore the mark of rebellion and the ancient curse. The rebellious will always face their consequences, whether they choose to ignore or defy them. Canaan, through his stubbornness, sealed a dark fate for himself and his descendants. And the Tower of Babel, looming like a ghost in history, reminds us that every brick laid upon pride will only lead to ruin and destruction. In the 35th Jubilee, during the third week of the first year, Ru, a descendant of Noah, took a wife named Orah, the daughter of Uar of the line of Etched. It was the beginning of a tragedy that would span generations. In the 7th year of that week, they bore a son and named him Siro. But the child grew up in an age when mankind had turned its back on the light, sinking into sin and violence. They no longer revered the Creator, but waged war against one another, took captives, slaughtered their own brothers, and spilled blood across the face of the earth. It was said that during this time, mankind's cruelty reached its height. Weapons forged in fire and cold metal, swords and spears, were raised against any who stood in their way. Fathers taught their sons the art of war. Brothers turned their blades upon one another. Cities crumbled into smoke and ashes, and the wailing of the afflicted echoed across the heavens. Strong towers and massive walls rose only to be seized and destroyed by enemies. Amid rivers of blood, mankind began to trade human lives like cheap goods, men and women in chains, cast into the darkness of slavery and despair. During this era, Uar, the son of Etched, built a city and named it Era of the Chaldees in honor of himself and his father. But soon, the hands of skillful craftsmen fell into temptation. They fashioned molten images of gold and bronze, carved lifeless statues, and bowed before them like gods. These idols were not only the fruit of human arrogance, but the gateway through which wicked spirits entered the world of men. Mastema, the ruler of darkness, stood in the cold shadows, a cruel smile on his lips. It was he who sent forth these malevolent spirits, spreading sin and leading humanity into impurity. Under his hand, the world descended into chaos. Seeing the corruption around him, Ru named his son Siro, meaning turning away. For mankind had turned from righteousness, embracing wickedness and sin. Siro grew up in a world drowning in darkness and bloodshed. His lineage gradually moved to dwell in Uar of the Chaldees, a land both mysterious and steeped in sin. There, men no longer looked to the heavens for salvation, but fixed their eyes upon the stars and heavenly signs, seeking prophecies of their fates. In the 36th Jubilee, during the 5th week of the first year, Siro took a wife named Melka, the daughter of Cabir, of a near kinsman. From this union, they bore Nahor in the first year of that week. Nahor grew up in Uar of the Chaldees, where his father taught him the art of astrology, the reading of signs in the heavens to discern the fate of men. Night after night, Nahor lifted his eyes to the sky, listening to the whispers of the stars. Yet the knowledge he acquired was not of light, but a darker wisdom, tainted by the shadow of Mastema. In the 37th Jubilee, during the 6th week of the first year, Nahor took a wife named Ajaska, the daughter of Nestag, a Chaldean. In the 7th year of that week, they bore a son and named him Terah. But Terah was born into an age of hardship and calamity. Mastema, the ruler of darkness, relentlessly sought to torment the descendants of Noah. He sent forth ravens and wild birds to ravage the fields. Seeds sown by human hands were stolen before they could take root, casting the people into hunger and despair. Fields lay barren, and black clouds of birds descended from the heavens like a living curse. Because of this calamity, Terah was named, meaning trouble. for the destruction wrought by the ravens and birds had stolen all of mankind's labor, leaving only tears and hopelessness upon the land. Farmers lifted their eyes to the heavens, pleading for a miracle, but all they heard was the harsh cawing of ravens, mocking them with the laughter of Mastema from afar. The world was no longer the redeemed earth that had survived the great flood. It had become a place of darkness, consumed by ambition, war, and idolatry. Self-proclaimed kings ruled cities. Warriors sharpened their swords beneath the moonlight, and the people bowed before lifeless idols, forgetting their creator. Mastema did not need to appear. He simply released his wicked spirits and watched from afar, savoring victory as men destroyed themselves. From the line of Noah, the fragments of hope grew ever more fractured. Men like Siro, Nahor, and Terah were born into the shadow of sin, where every breath was tainted by humanity's fall. In the land of Ur of the Chaldees, where the heavens were filled with mysterious signs, the darkness grew thicker than ever before. Yet amid all the chaos and ruin, there remained a prophecy yet unrevealed, a faint light hidden away, awaiting the day it would shatter the darkness that Mastema had so carefully woven. In the days of drought and gloom, when the earth seemed to refuse life and the fruits of the trees were devoured by flocks of ravenous birds, darkness of despair covered the land. Those years dragged on like a curse, as men could do nothing but lift their eyes to the blackened skies filled with ravens and wild birds, watching the labor of their hands stolen away. To preserve what little food they could from the silent famine, they toiled twice as hard. Yet hunger and hardship always loomed. The shadow of Mastema still weighed heavily upon the earth, turning every effort of mankind into dust. In the 39th Jubilee, during the second week of the first year, Terah, a descendant of Noah, took a wife named Edna, the daughter of Abram, a close bond within their lineage. It was a time of chaos, yet from this union, a child was born in the 7th year of that week. They named him Abram in memory of his grandfather, who had passed before the child was formed in his mother's womb. From birth, Abram seemed destined for a greater purpose, a strange light flickering amid the darkness that consumed humanity. As Abram grew, his eyes did not behold the false beauty of human creation, nor was his vision clouded by the lifeless idols worshipped across the land. He soon discerned the corruption and folly of mankind. Molten images and carefully carved statues had become the gods of men, while the true light of the Creator was forgotten. When his father taught him to write, Abram began to understand the world's faults. By the time he was only 2 weeks old, he had separated himself from his father, refusing to bow to these unclean and meaningless things. Abram began to pray to the Creator of all things. His prayers rose amid a world of terror and chaos. He pleaded to be delivered from the impurity of mankind, that his portion would not fall into the spiral of sin and depravity. A light ignited within him, and from that moment, a strange strength began to take root, heralding a miracle amid the age of darkness. As the years passed and the season for sowing came upon the land, the afflicted people ventured to the fields, carrying seeds of hope. But the black ravens were already waiting in the skies. They descended like a storm, stealing every seed before it could take root. Despair filled the eyes of the farmers, but among them, a boy of only 14 stepped forward. Abram ran into the fields, facing the swarming ravens that darkened the heavens like storm clouds. He lifted his hand and cried aloud, his voice like a sharp command tearing through the air, "Do not come down. Return to the place from which you came." The ravens, as if overwhelmed by an invisible force, suddenly turned their wings and flew away. That day, Abram repeated this act 70 times. Every flock of ravens across the land where he lived was driven away, and not a single bird dared return. The people of the land stood frozen, their eyes wide with astonishment as they witnessed this miracle. Whispers about Abram spread quickly, the boy who could command the ravens with his voice. His name traveled throughout the land of Chaldea, becoming a beacon of hope for the desperate farmers. That year, anyone who wished to sow their fields sought Abram. He went with them, standing in their fields, guarding their seeds from the destructive birds. The seeds were planted in peace, grew strong, and yielded an abundant harvest. That year, the people ate their fill and rejoiced in the happiness they thought had been lost. Not stopping there, Abram, with his wisdom and ingenuity, devised a solution to free the people from their fear of the birds stealing their seeds. In the first year of the 5th week, Abram instructed the craftsmen to create special tools attached to the plows. These tools carried small vessels designed to hold seeds, releasing them into the earth with each rhythm of the plow. The seeds were buried deep in the soil, far from the sight of the ravens. These vessels were quickly adopted across the land. Fields were carefully sown, and the terror of the black ravens vanished completely. The harvests flourished, and the people began to see Abram as a savior, while the rest of the world remained mired in darkness and despair. Abram, still but a boy, had ignited a light of hope and change. Though young, Abram displayed extraordinary strength, not only in his actions but also in his soul. His connection to the Creator and his courage in standing against the dark forces of Mastema made him a symbol of resistance against sin and corruption. The world at that time was filled with idols, greed, and violence. Yet Abram began a different path, a path that led to righteousness and light. In the 6th week, the 7th year of that time, under the stifling atmosphere of cities shadowed by lifeless idols, Abram lifted his head and looked toward his father, Terah. He approached and spoke, his eyes gleaming with the light of awakening. "Father!" Terah looked at his son, a flicker of worry hidden behind his weary eyes, and replied, "Here I am, my son." But Abram had not come to speak of ordinary things. He gazed into his father's eyes, his voice low yet as powerful as the wind crashing upon the shore. "What benefit do we gain from the idols that you and the people worship? These images have no soul. They are but stone and bronze, lifeless works made by the hands of men. They cannot speak, they cannot hear, they cannot help. Why, then, do we bow before them?" In the stillness that followed, Abram's words burned like a fire, piercing the darkness. He continued, his voice filled with faith and conviction. "Worship the God of heaven, the one who sends rain and dew upon the earth, who created all things by his word. All life flows from his presence. Why do we bow before these lifeless objects, carrying them upon our shoulders as burdens, expecting deliverance from them? It is deception, a shame for those who make them and for those who worship them." Terah stood silent, his shoulders weighed as though bearing the burden of the world itself. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft and trembling like a candle before the wind. "What you say is true, Abram, but you do not understand. I live among people who compel me to serve these idols. If I speak the truth, they will kill me. Their hearts are bound to these images, and they will not forgive one who speaks against them. Be silent, my son, before you bring ruin upon yourself." But Abram could not remain silent. It was as though a sacred fire burned within him, and his father's words only deepened his resolve. He shared his convictions with his 2 brothers, but they grew angry with him, their eyes piercing him like daggers. At last, Abram kept his silence, though the fire within him continued to blaze. He saw clearly the falsehood and decay of the world around him. Time passed, and in the 40th Jubilee, during the 2nd week of the 7th year, Abram took a wife named Sarai, the daughter of Terah and his half-sister. Sarai was not only his wife, but also his companion on the path of trials and the destiny prepared for them. Beside Abram, Sarai was like a gentle yet steadfast lamp, illuminating the steps of a man whose faith burned brightly. During this time, Haran, Abram's brother, also took a wife. In the 3rd year of the 3rd week, Haran's wife bore him a son. The child was named Lot, a name destined to become intertwined with Abram's life in the years to come. Lot grew as an important piece in Abram's story, one who would walk with him through trials and witness great wonders. Those years were marked by a world still steeped in the worship of silent idols and lifeless forms. But Abram was different. He continually asked himself, why do men place their trust in these lifeless things? Why do they not lift their eyes to heaven, where the true God dwells, who created all things and gives life to the world? Abram felt his heart drawing farther from his family and the people around him, those who blindly bowed to carved stones. Abram grew up with questions unanswered, but not in despair. With each passing day, he kept the flame of faith alive in his heart. The fields and walls of Ur of the Chaldees, covered with idols, became the backdrop for the quiet rebellion of a boy. The world did not yet know that from this darkness, one man was rising, carrying a mission that would transform all of humanity. The story of Abram was not merely the tale of an individual, but the voice of awakening in an age smothered by sin and blindness. Though Terah and those around him were bound by fear and the habit of idolatry, Abram stepped beyond those paths. He envisioned a different world, a world where men worshipped the true Creator, where light would conquer darkness and faith would replace fear. In the thick darkness of the land of the Chaldees, where temples to idols stood like soulless specters, a fire silently began to burn, not only within a man's heart, but among the silent stone structures of a misguided age. On that fateful night, Abram, a soul of light amid the darkness of ignorance, arose. His eyes opened wide as he gazed upon the idols that so many bowed to in folly. Without a word, without warning, he set the entire temple ablaze, the flames roaring as though reflecting heaven's wrath against humanity's deception. The fire consumed every statue, destroying all within the temple as though the true God himself had grown angry at man's falsehood. Yet no one knew it was Abram's hand that caused it. The people of Ur awoke in the dead of night as smoke and fire spread through the air. Cries of terror echoed as they saw their gods engulfed in flames. In their panic, they rushed to save the lifeless statues as though these could answer their pleas. Haran, Abram's brother, was the first to charge into the fire in desperation, trying to rescue the unresponsive idols. But the flames showed no mercy. They raged as though strengthened by the darkness, consuming Haran and claiming his life in a red fury. Before Terah, his father, Haran breathed his last, and they buried him where he died, in Ur of the Chaldees, a city now bearing the marks of an extraordinary fire. The event was a terrifying warning, but also a turning point that marked the beginning of an exodus. Terah, weighed down by grief for his son and fear of what had occurred, resolved to leave Ur with his sons. They journeyed through desolate lands, moving toward Lebanon and the land of Canaan, but ultimately settled in Haran, a distant and silent place. Abram, who had kindled this upheaval, remained with his father, though his heart yearned for something greater, something beyond. In the 5th year of the 6th week that followed, as darkness covered the earth and a pale crescent moon shone faintly, Abram sat alone, his eyes fixed on the star-filled heavens. From evening until morning, he observed the movement of the stars, seeking signs of the future and the rains to come. Such was the tradition of the Chaldees, a people who believed that the stars held the keys to destiny. But as the starlight reflected in Abram's contemplative gaze, a new thought pierced his mind. The signs of the stars, the moon, and the sun are all in the hands of God. Why should I seek them? If He wills it, He will send the rains or hold them back. Everything rests in His hands. This thought came as a whisper from the depths of his soul, a revelation that caused Abram to abandon reliance on the mystical signs. He understood that nothing lay outside the power of the Most High, the Creator of all things. In the quiet of the night, he knelt and prayed, his voice rising like a response from earth to heaven. O Lord, my God, the Most High, You alone are my God, and I have chosen You and Your dominion. You created all things, and all things are the work of Your hands. Deliver me from the hand of the unclean spirits who rule the thoughts of men's hearts. Let them not lead me astray from You, my God, and grant that I and my descendants may stand firm forever, never straying from You now and forevermore. It was not merely a prayer but a sacred vow, an unshakable declaration of faith in the Creator. In a world where unclean spirits and idols still reigned, Abram chose a different path, one that led toward light, though it was a path fraught with trials and dangers. As the sun rose over the horizon, Abram lifted his head, his eyes blazing with resolve. A question stirred within him. Should I return to Ur of the Chaldees, where those of old still seek me? Or should I remain here and wait for the path that He has set before me? A deep struggle tore through Abram's heart, yet he trusted that God's way would succeed through His servant. He vowed not to lose his way, nor allow his heart to sink into falsehood and deception. That night, Abram no longer sought answers among the stars, for he had come to understand that every destiny and every sign lay in the hands of the Most High. It was a turning point in his faith, a shift from doubt and dependence on mystical signs to complete trust in God alone. The world around him remained steeped in idol worship and sins that could not be erased. But Abram chose to stand against the current, alone in the darkness. The fire in his heart shone brighter than any star in the sky. In the pages of the Book of Jubilees, Abram emerges as a symbol of unwavering faith, a man bold enough to break the chains of the past and walk toward the light where God awaited him. The night may have covered the earth. Abram had begun a journey that would rewrite the history of mankind. And when men looked back upon the ruined temples and the idols reduced to ash, they would see not merely the remnants of a fallen age, but the beginning of an eternal faith where darkness could never prevail. The light of Abram had been kindled, and the world would never be the same again. In the deep of night, the stars shimmered as though conversing with Abram, but he no longer sought answers from them. Instead, he prayed to the Most High, asking Him for guidance and direction. As his prayer ended, the silence of the heavens seemed to break, and a divine command tore through the thick darkness like a beam of light from heaven. Leave your country, your kindred, and your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great and mighty nation. I will bless you and make your name great. You shall be blessed upon the earth, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed through you. These words resounded within Abram like a bell, signaling a destiny already ordained. The Creator had not only promised a bright future for Abram, but for his descendants through all eternity. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. I will be your God, the God of your children, and the God of your descendants. Fear not, for from this day forward and forever, I am your God. When Abram opened his eyes, his chest rose and fell with the moment's weight, his hands trembling as though grasping something unseen yet immeasurably powerful. The promise burned like a sacred fire within him, dispelling all doubt and fear. At that moment, a miracle occurred. An angel from heaven opened Abram's mouth, ears, and lips, restoring to him the sacred language lost since the fall of the Tower of Babel. The Hebrew tongue, the language of creation, was given back to him, affirming his divine connection with the Creator. Abram began to speak this language. It sounded deep and mysterious, echoing as though from the dawn of time. He sought out the ancient books of his forefathers, written in this forgotten tongue. Dust-laden pages held knowledge long concealed, and Abram carefully transcribed them. For 6 months of reign, he studied diligently, contemplating every word, and with the angel's guidance, the mysteries of creation slowly unfolded before him. This was not merely human wisdom but divine revelation, given to him as a key to unlock the door to a great destiny. In the 7th year of the 6th week, Abram came to Terah, his father, and declared that he would leave Haran to go to the land of Canaan, the distant place appointed for him by God. Standing before his father, Abram spoke with resolve, though his voice carried a tinge of sorrow. Terah, though pained by the departure of his son, knew this was a fate that could not be denied. He looked at Abram, the eyes of an old father heavy with concern, but also filled with pride. Terah replied, "Go in peace, my son. May the eternal God make your path straight. May he be with you, protect you from all evil, and grant you grace, mercy, and favor before those you meet along the way. May no man have the power to harm you. Go forth in peace." These words of blessing surrounded Abram like an invisible armor. He felt the protection of the Most High and the deep love of his father. Terah added, his voice steady but solemn, "If you find a land that is beautiful and worthy to dwell in, return and take me with you. Bring Lot, the son of your brother Haran, with you, and treat him as your own son. May the Lord God be with you throughout this journey. As for Nahor, your brother, he will remain here with me until you return in peace, and then we will go with you." Terah's words carried both sorrow and hope as though sealing a final farewell. Lot, the orphan nephew, would accompany Abram, a remaining connection to his family on this distant journey. The pieces of destiny were falling into place. Abram bowed before his father, his heart filled with faith and resolve. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, but he also knew that God had chosen him and would guide him. The promises of God shone like light upon the darkened path of a chaotic world. A single man, carrying the burning faith of the Most High, stepped away from the safety of his home and family to journey toward a distant land of promise. Yet he did not walk in darkness. The light of God's promise, sacred knowledge, and trimal language guided him through every danger. Abram began his journey, which would cause his name to echo across generations, and through him, all the families of the earth would be blessed. The fire of faith and courage within Abram did not simply open a new path. It dispelled the darkness that had enshrouded humanity for generations. That night, the sky above Haran gleamed as though the stars bore witness to the steps of a man chosen by God. And as Abram set out, the earth seemed to tremble beneath the feet of one who carried a divine mission from the Creator. Darkness would remain, but the light had found its bearer, and through him, it would spread to the ends of the earth. When mankind, in arrogance, breaks the established order and aspires to surpass the fate ordained for them, the inevitable consequence is division, chaos, and destruction. The curses born of greed and rebellion take root not only in the land, but also weigh heavily upon future generations. Yet, amid such error and darkness, there have always been those who dare to rise, seeking the light of truth, absolute faith in the Creator, the courage to stand against falsehood, and the desire to break free from the chains of sin are the keys that lead humanity out of the abyss. Greatness lies not in power or grand achievements, but in humility, righteousness, and enduring faith. Remember, the scars of wrong choices will remain etched through time, but the light of true faith will overcome all darkness, leading mankind back to order and eternal salvation. Please subscribe to our channel to enjoy more captivating Bible stories from us.